The Battle of Alma was the first battle during the Crimean War of 1854 to 56, and references to Alma and the other Crimean War battles are all over the place. In St Albans, where I grew up and went to school, there's an Alma Road and also an Inkerman Road nearby. And many viewers have written into me to point out the number of Alma pubs there are in the UK. I've counted at least 20 in England alone. And many of my Australian followers have told me about roads and whole towns named after Crimean War battles down under, especially in the state of Victoria. But I have a personal link to this battle that took place nearly 170 years ago. Growing up in Hertfordshire, I lived in a Victorian house called Alma, because the builder was a Crimean War veteran who'd fought at that battle. But why did this battle, and indeed the Crimean War, ever take place? Well, the Crimean Peninsula can be found on the Black Sea and is politically part of Ukraine, although it was annexed by Russia in 2014. Part of the Ottoman Empire for 300 years, the Russians under Catherine the Great conquered it in the 1780s. In fact, it was this continuing Russian expansion that lay at the roots of the Crimean War. By the 1850s, Russia was starting to eye up the declining Ottoman Empire, an empire which the Russian Tsar, Nicholas I, described as the sick man of Europe. First, there were the Balkans. The Ottoman subjects in the Balkans were, like the Russians, predominantly Slavs. They were also fellow Orthodox Christians, and the Russians felt that they had a moral duty to both defend and lead them out of what they called Turkish tyranny. Well, that was the moral high ground. But the Tsar also had his eyes on a far greater prize: the Ottoman capital at Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul. Control of Constantinople would give the Russians a seaport they could use all year round, unlike the icebound ports in the Baltic and indeed in the Arctic Circle. That would also allow them to play a significant role in the Mediterranean. And that brought them into potential conflict with France and Great Britain, who regarded that sea as their sphere of influence. And even at this stage, before the Suez Canal had even been constructed, Britain saw her strong presence in the Mediterranean as defending her prized imperial possession of India. Quite frankly, neither the British nor the French Emperor, Napoleon III, wanted the Russians interloping in the Med. And whilst the French and British were no great fans of the Ottoman Empire, and indeed they were already starting to pursue policies to wrest parts of North Africa from that empire, they saw supporting the Ottomans as a way of thwarting Russian designs in the Med. Matters actually came to a head over religion, or more importantly, the Christian holy places in the Ottoman-controlled city of Jerusalem. Tensions have been growing between Catholic and Orthodox monks in the Holy City, which often, hard to believe, actually ended up in fistfights between different monks. And the Tsar saw this minor spat between the monks as an opportunity to squeeze the sick man of Europe. And he sent an ultimatum to the Ottoman Emperor, demanding the right to protect all of the Ottomans' 10 million Orthodox subjects, principally in the Balkans. Not surprisingly, the Ottomans refused point blank to have a rival and indeed aggressive power involved in their internal affairs. Never known for his subtlety, Tsar Nicholas now moved Russian troops into the nominal Ottoman provinces of Moldova and modern-day Romania. And in response, the Ottomans declared war on the 5th of October 1853. In November that year, the Russian Navy sailed out of their base at Sevastopol in the Crimea and attacked the Ottoman fleet at Sinope, sinking all bar one ship and effectively gaining control of the Black Sea. This the French and British would not allow. The Russians had to be stopped and their fleet at Sevastopol neutralised. Finally, in March 1854, France and Britain entered the war in support of the Ottomans. A naval task force was actually first off sent to the Baltic under Sir Charles Napier, which was, well, reasonably close to Britain and was like a low-hanging fruit option. But the main thrust of the Anglo-French effort was in the Black Sea, where the Ottomans had been forced onto the defensive in the Balkans, and the Russian fleet could sail unopposed to Constantinople. A joint expeditionary force was sent via Varna, which is in modern-day Bulgaria, and then on to the Crimea, arriving 15 miles north of Sevastopol on the 14th of September, 1854. A vast armada of 600 ships was an impressive sight off the coast. A Russian scout sent from Sevastopol, 50 miles to the south, described the array of masts looking like thousands of church steeples, or as he described it, Holy Moscow on the waves. 27,000 British troops were landed under the command of Waterloo veteran Lord Raglan. 30,000 French and 7,000 Ottoman troops also landed with them. It was the biggest amphibious landing undertaken by the British Army to that date. A British army who hadn't been into action against a European foe since the Battle of Waterloo back in 1815. And that lack of experience started to show logistically as the British decided to leave all their bulky equipment on the ships to allow a faster march to Sevastopol. Bulky equipment such as ambulances, medical supplies and tents. Private Donald Cameron of the 93rd Highland Regiment recalls trying to sleep whilst holding a blanket at arm's length over his prone body to try and keep the rain off, so the rain would in theory fall either side of this blanket, which was sodden with water. The logistical problems that beset the British Army, the French were better set up, is something I will cover in another video, especially the almost non-existent medical care for Britain's biggest war in 40 years. Despite an outbreak of cholera, which had followed the army from Varna in Bulgaria, the Allies now proceeded to advance on the Russian naval base at Sevastopol. The French were marched close to the coast with the warships providing cannon support for them, and the British marching abreast but inland of them with the light brigade of cavalry protecting their flank. Marching to the popular tune Cheer Boys Cheer, which became to the British troops in Crimea what It's a Long Way to Tipperary became to soldiers in the First World War, 6 days later, on the 20th of September, they came face to face with the Russians at the Alma River. The Russian army of approximately 37,000 men were drawn up on the heights to the south of the river, and in their centre, their commander, General Menshikov, had placed his over 100 artillery pieces, ready to blast the Allied army as it advanced. With this redoubt in the centre and almost sheer cliffs at the mouth of the river, Menshikov confidently predicted that he could hold this formidable position for 3 weeks. In fact, he was so confident in this position and the elan of the Russian troops that he invited leading citizens of Sevastopol to join him as spectators for the coming battle. So, somewhat bizarrely, we actually had ladies arriving in carriages with picnics to watch a battle, rather like, watching the races. The Allies attacked in the same formation as their advance, with the French on the right near the coast and the British inland. And so it happened that the British would face the Russian strongpoint, that redoubt with the massive cannons. The attack on the Great Redoubt would be led by the Light Division of Infantry, under Sir George Brown, consisting of the Rifle Brigade and Major General Codrington's 1st Brigade of the 7th, the 23rd and the 33rd Duke of Wellington's regiments of foot. And they would be backed up by the 1st Division, consisting of the Guards Brigade, commanded by Queen Victoria's cousin, the Duke of Cambridge, and the Highland Brigade, under General Colin Campbell, who would later find fame with the Thin Red Line at the Battle of Balaclava and in the Indian Mutiny. To their right, the 2nd Division would fill the gap between the British and the French attacks, and they would be supported by the British 3rd Division. Meanwhile, the 4th Division would remain in the rear, and the Light Brigade would continue to cover their flanks inland. The French attacked first, storming the cliff heights, and then also crossing the River Alma towards Telegraph Hill. The successful scaling of the cliffs was impressive, but the French were too few at that end of the battlefield and too far from the main redoubt to cause Menshikov too much concern. He was more concerned with the British advance coming up the hill in front of the redoubt. And at midday, the British finally moved forward. As they advanced, the Russians set fire to the village of Bolyok. The buildings had been stuffed with hay and explosives. This had the effect of splitting the advance of the 2nd Division, with the 30th and 55th Regiments of Foot going to the west, in other words the coastal side of the village, and the 95th, later the Sherwood Foresters, going inland. Now separated from the rest of the 2nd Division, the 95th fell in with the Light Division, heading towards the Great Redoubt. By now, the mighty cannon of the Russian army had opened up on the advancing British troops. Wading across the Alma River, they were faced with a bank which was nearly 6 foot high on the other side. The only saving grace was it gave the men of the Light Division some protection from the artillery fire coming down from them from above. The Light Division's commander, General Sir George Brown, rode along the riverbank and urged his men to follow him. And they did. Armed with the new mini rifle, which had a far greater range and accuracy than the Russian muskets, the British started to deliver a strong rifle fire on the crews of those Russian guns. And as they continued to advance, Menshikov started to fear that he might lose the guns themselves. And for those of you who've watched my video on the charge of the Light Brigade, you will be aware that having your artillery captured by the enemy was seen as a humiliation that had to be prevented at all costs. So the Russian general ordered his guns to retreat. Which was just as well, because if they had fired canister shot at short range on the advancing British, the casualties could have been even worse than they actually were in this battle. But by the time the battered Light Division had reached the redoubt, those Russians were in the process of fleeing with their guns, although not all of them got away. Before they could celebrate their success, the Light Division looked up to see the massed ranks of Russian infantry bearing down on them with fixed bayonets. Outnumbered and having suffered about 700 casualties, the Light Division sorely needed the 1st Division to come up and join them fast. However, the Duke of Cambridge was only now ordering his men forward. As the Guards and Highland Brigades finally crossed the Alma River and started to advance up the hill, they were met by the Light Division retreating down the hill in some disorder. The sheer force of numbers of those retreating men forced the Scots Fusilier Guards back down the hill to the banks of the river itself. But meanwhile, the Coldstream and Grenadier Guards pushed past the retreating Light Division and then fired 2 volleys at the Russians. The range and accuracy of those melee rifles came as a shock to the Russians, who were realising they wouldn't get close enough to use their bayonets, and they started to fall back. Meanwhile, the Highland Brigade under Campbell were rapidly moving to outflank the redoubt and were starting to pour fire into the Russian massed ranks. And over on the British right, the depleted 2nd Division had taken Telegraph Hill, adjacent and slightly behind the redoubt. Batteries of Royal Artillery arrived on the captured hill and started now to open fire upon the exposed Russian flank. In the centre, the Coldstream and Grenadier Guards now retook the redoubt, and Menshikov ordered a general retreat. The ladies didn't bother to pack up their picnics as they fled in their carriages. It was 4 p.m. The position that the Russian prince had claimed he could hold for 3 weeks had fallen in a matter of hours. In that time, the British had lost 2,000 men killed, wounded or missing, about 7% of their total army strength. The Grenadier Guards had lost 130 men, whilst the Scots Fusilier Guards had lost 160. Over a third of the total British casualties had been borne by the Light Division with their initial advance on the redoubt. Of the regiments who had stormed the redoubt, the 33rd, the Duke of Wellington's, had suffered 239 casualties. The 19th, the Green Howards, lost 210. And the 95th, who had detached themselves from the 2nd Division as they passed through the burning village, well, they'd lost 190 men. The French, whilst advancing first and storming the cliffs, had played a less bloody role in this particular battle, mainly because they weren't facing the main strong point of the Russian army, the redoubt. Nevertheless, they estimated they'd suffered 1,300 casualties, although British commander Lord Raglan believed it to be about half that number. And the Russians? The Russians had lost 5,700 men killed, wounded or captured, about 1 in 6 of Menshikov's army. As the Russians retreated, Raglan refused to send in the Light Brigade to mop things up. They'd have to wait for another day for their moment of glory. The Allies spent the next 2 days tending to the wounded before resuming their advance on Sevastopol. This gave Menshikov time to fall back on the naval base in some semblance of order, and then he ordered the naval commander to hold the base while he marched his army inland to threaten the Allied flank. In an interesting footnote, as the Allies finally advanced on the 23rd of September, Raglan rode ahead of his army scouting, and upon entering a village, found himself surrounded by Russian troops. He had just run into the rear guard of Menshikov's army that was retreating inland. Both sides seemed completely surprised by the presence of the other, and Raglan was able to ride away totally unharmed. Not realising the weakness of the Russian position, the Allies decided that rather than storming Sevastopol, they would besiege the Russian naval base. Basing themselves on the heights to the south of the city, that's right, they actually marched right past Sevastopol rather than attacking it to then lay siege from the south. The British were to hold the right-hand side of this siege position using the port of Balaclava as their supply depot. The siege was to last for a year. The war itself would drag on for another 18 months. In January 1855, the Kingdom of Sardinia joined the Allied cause, and by the war's conclusion, over 500,000 troops from all sides would have died. The majority of the British deaths would actually come from disease rather than Russian bullets. Meanwhile, Menshikov bided his time, waiting to strike at the Allies at their weakest spot. And a month later, he struck at Balaclava. That battle with the famous Thin Red Line, the charge of the Heavy Brigade and the charge of the Light Brigade is the subject of another one of my videos. And as for that veteran who built my childhood home and his experience at Alma, well, that feels like a detective story that I'm going to have to embark on in the future. The Battle of Alma, 20th of September, 1854. Well, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this story from the Crimean War. I've got a few more from this war lined up, including the Siege of Sevastopol, the Baltic Campaign, and the Sisters of Mercy, Florence Nightingale and the other women who nursed wounded British soldiers during this campaign. They're on the way, along with, well, more military history stories. But until then, keep well, and I'll see you very soon.